live from the nation's capital. Matthew Doarnberger is with us tonight. LibertarianSportsFan.com, LibertarianSportsFan.com. And I assure you, you will get an actual record of this within the next 24 to 48 hours. So you'll be able to, if you missed anything in the next segment, you'll be able to pick up on it. I'm quite certain there are a great many things that we want to talk about here. But first and foremost, I got to be the devil's advocate. Matthew, why are you so against black men in America?
I'm against victimization. I'm against this idea that Kyle Korver's putting forward. Is Kyle Korver pro-black men in America? He would like to think so, of course. That's, of course, the point of the article he wrote. Look how black person I am. I'm going to write this article here. And it went from there.
Exactly. Now, a lot of people get offended when we talk about privilege. And they get offended in this particular capacity that there is definitely racism in America. Black people are not getting along well. They're not doing as well publicly or privately. And it's all because of racism. I got to ask you here, is that the biggest thing holding black people or Hispanic people or any people back in this particular country?
Well, no. The biggest thing holding people back are the problem that people face are other social that have stemmed from many times bad government policy and things like that. But no, they're not problems of racism. If many of these communities, these black communities, are living under the rule of an entirely black government. The people in a given city, inner city black area, the mayor of the city council, many times even the police department they're very often black and and yet these problems still persist. So if the problem is just racist white people coming in and wrecking everything, well then why of these overwhelmingly black areas that are represented so well in local governments, why are they facing so many of these problems that Korver addresses? And he doesn't address that. He sees it as a problem of racism.
Exactly. And in one of his statements in the article Privileged, which is directly translated privilege in NBA circles, he says, there's an elephant in the room that I've been thinking about a lot over these last few weeks. It's the fact that demographically, if we're being honest, I have more in common with the fans and the crowd at your average NBA game than I have with the players on the court. And after the events in Salt Lake City last month, and as we've been discussing them since, I've really started to recognize the role those demographics play in my privilege. First and foremost, what is he talking about in the sense of privilege? Is it just related to the NBA and those who happen to be in the stands, or is there something greater to that? And lastly, do you believe that you have privilege that others don't have in this society?
Well, what he's saying, he's describing a couple of incidents with a couple of first of all, a teammate who was arrested, and then an incident with Russell Westbrook where he got into it with a fan, and there was some ugliness to that, and they ended up the stadium ended up banning the fan from coming back. But it seems to be there are a few guys, Westbrook being one of them, who just routinely get into this with fans, and the
Yeah.
rest of the league, which is overwhelmingly black, about 75% black, does not get into it the way he does. Uh, but oh yeah, as far as privilege goes, there is a privilege here. I said this. I've said this before. There is a privilege that Korver's talking about with regard to the social problems that he addresses here towards the end of the article. About he talks about blacks in prisons, and blacks not having as much wealth as whites do, and things like that. Well, there's a privilege that has to go in that goes into that, but it's not white privilege. It's having two parents in your life privilege. That's the real privilege that happens, and the statistics are out there for anyone to see. If you have a father in your life, you're statistically less likely to be involved in criminal activity, less likely to go to prison, less likely to be poor, and a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, and then you look at the statistics when it comes to Black Americans, how many of them grow up in a single parent home. And since the war on poverty was declared back in the 1960s, over $20 trillion has been spent on that, and yet the fatherless child rate in the Black community has skyrocketed. I think it's somewhere around 70 to 75% of Black children grow up in single parent homes now. It's something around there, and so yeah, when you have a certain segment of your population that has these kinds of traits that result in these social problems, then yeah, they're going to be underprivileged, but it doesn't have to do with their race. It has to do with how they grew up and what their family structure was. And I'm sure it's that way for anyone of anyone who grew up without a father, but it's that it's become so pronounced because it's so common in the Black community these days.
Exactly. The gold glistens greatly because there's more of it in certain communities than in others. But you're right in terms of the statistics regarding the absence of a father in any racial or ethnic group. The lack of a father in a household tends to lead to poverty. It tends to lead to criminality. It tends to lead to brokenness in families and in cultures and in communities. And those things exhibit themselves. But when he had the relationship as a player, when he had the relationships as a coach, he brought up two terms that most people who happen to follow AOC, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, subscribe to. This whole idea of guilt and responsibility that I want to talk with you for shortly
Right.
about the responsibility part of that. Do you feel responsible to me as a partial Black man, at least partially responsible to me because I'm partially Black? And from all my heritage, I also have white and as well as African and a few other things in there. But just principally on the Black part, American part, do you feel responsible for the fact that I was a slave or came from
I,
slave heritage?
I, I don't think anyone should feel responsible to anyone else, regardless of skin color, except to just respect them and to not do any harm. This goes into my libertarianism, but just not do any harm to their person or their property, and that's just pretty much the gist of it. Other than that, you're not responsible for anyone because of anything that happened to occur in the past. With regard to what Korver says about how we are responsible, we're not guilty, but we're responsible. What he's actually saying here, and I think this is important, is that if you're claiming that a group of people can't take responsibility, whether they're Blacks or otherwise, then you're essentially saying that someone else has to take responsibility for them. Oh, you don't think a group can be responsible. Well, why is that? Who needs to come in and save the day and take responsibility for this or that group, and why do they need to take it? What's wrong with the people who need to be taken responsibility for? Why couldn't they do it on their own? So you have this superiority inferiority dynamic there, with regard to what he says, and he doesn't elaborate on it to that degree, but
Exactly.
yeah, why? Yeah.
In terms of the sense of guilt, I've told people from the beginning of my show, and I do it at least once a year, I absolve all white people from all the sins of their forefathers. So that
Great,
way you don't have
great.
to worry about that when you go before the priest. That's one less
Yeah.
prayer. But
I think
I
think Walter Williams has a similar contract he uses with his students in his economics class. But anyway.
In a sense, why is that a sense of false guilt as well as false bravado for someone of a liberal persuasion coming to me and saying, my people put you in slavery, or at least your people in slavery, so I feel guilty about that. So what can I do for you? Can I give you reparations? What can I do to make that better for you?
Yeah, well, you've touched on kind of a hot button issue, because there are a number of Democratic candidates who are running for president who are kind of throwing this around, the idea of reparations for slavery given to blacks. But if you think through it, I think you realize just how ridiculous it gets with who pays the money and who gets the money, considering that first of all, it's been so long, but then the United States is so mixed up, and we've had so much in the way of immigration and things like that. The vast majority of whites didn't own slaves. The big influx in white immigration didn't happen really until the late 1800s. It had ended in this country. So many white people are descendants of immigrants who came at that time, usually poor immigrants. And if you're poor, you're not going to own any slaves. So right. So I mean, and you think through who's going to get this money. Well, okay, you have blacks, and most of them in this country are descended from slaves, but not all. Someone like Barack Obama, of course, was the son of a black immigrant, or a black African who was not a slave. That's not in this country, and other blacks are the same way. A lot of times, not the descendants of slaves. Also, if you're half black, how does that work? Do you get half the money? I don't. So
I get 1/4.
So many questions, unanswered questions out there as far as reparations go. I know you're very entertained by this.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I don't actually understand. First and foremost, blacks own slaves too. Native
Right,
Americans own
that's also
slaves.
true. Yeah, some of them did.
Exactly. And the greatest slave ownership was not of white Protestants here in America. It was actually Latin Americans in places like Brazil and
Right.
other places like that. So I don't understand why reparations is only limited to just those who happen to be on the shores of this particular place. But again, it goes back to the whole idea of of who's responsible for people. Am I correct?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, it has to. That's another thing. If you're rich and black, would you get money too? Would people who are like middle class or poor white people, go to people go to blacks who are wealthy, because you're assuming that that slavery held blacks down, but some blacks are, doing pretty well in this nation,
Matthew,
but do they
Matthew,
get more money now because
exactly.
of that?
Matthew, I got to ask you here, how is it
Mm,
that in a sport where the majority of the players are black, virtually about 90% of the NBA players are black, and they make well over millions of dollars a year
right.
to play a game for 82 games out of the year. Some going to the playoffs and they get little awards and things like that for participation. But how is it that those individuals cling to victimization? How is that done?
Yeah. Well, a lot of them, it did come from a poor or very modest background. So they're claiming uh, things based on what they saw. So I don't want to dismiss that. A lot of them
Yeah.
do come from poverty and get to the level where they're making the kind of money that they're making. So okay, um, but a great point is made by an author named Shelby Steele. I don't know if you're
Yeah.
familiar with him or
Yeah.
not. He wrote a book called White Guilt, which is a phenomenal book. But he talks about why it is that blacks are so successful and the things we think about them being successful in this country, athletics and music as well, and things like that. And his point was that the reason for this isn't because of some government program or because of some victimhood and he was given and that was and that was how this happened. His point is that blacks, with regard to these things, take full responsibility for uh, for bettering themselves, for bettering their game. If there's a weakness in your game, you work on your weakness until it becomes your strength. And and the competition among blacks is intense, and that's a good thing. That competition brings out greatness. And with regard to this, there's no white, no one telling blacks that you're a victim and you can't compete and because of this or that. No, the blacks take responsibility for everything that happens on the field of play, and they better themselves accordingly. And this is why, or this is the reason there's been so much success among blacks in those areas, in areas of athletics, areas of music and comedy and things like that. It's a taking of responsibility. It's a rigorous commitment to excellence that they have, and I thought that was a great point from him.
I think so. I think so as well. Shelby still speaks to individual merit, and that
Right,
you don't collectively earn $1 million, because if that was the case, then
right.
LeBron James would earn the same thing as the guy who was number 12 on the team at the bottom of the bench.
Yeah.
At LibertarianSportsFan.com, how can people get to that? What is the essence behind what you do?
Well, there are a number of different topics that I cover. I cover everything from, like we're talking about tonight, race relations, but also the NCAA and what a lot of times goes on with them, with the the athletes that play under that organization, and it's anything else that comes up with political correctness, because there's so much of it in the world of sports. So
Yes, there is.
there's usually always something out there. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I write for a website called westernfreepress.com.
Hmm.
Um, and a website called grandoldssports.com. So people can reach me there. So,
Awesome. Matthew, it was great having you back on. We're going to have you back on very soon. There's a lot of stuff coming up
uh,
in the NFL and NBA and all
uh,
throughout the sports world that is just a microcosm of the actual culture at work, good, bad, and ugly. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Of course. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Doarnberger with us tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Libertarian Sports Fan, LibertarianSportsFan.com. We will be right back right after this message.
When I found out that there was an online travel